The safest place in a kingdom is not always
You may not
behind
enter
castle
here.
walls. Sometimes it
Why?
is the place built
let me
by
in.
one heart for
Please.
another. The first
Please.
light of dawn slipped through the stained glass windows of Ashford Palace, painting long
belong
ribbons
here.
of gold across polished stone corridors that had witnessed centuries of triumph, tradition, and quiet sorrow. Servants hurried through the halls carrying silver trays. Royal advisors discussed matters of state in hushed voices, and noble guests prepared for another day inside the magnificent palace. Hidden among them walked Charlotte Bennet, a young Omega with white skin and soft chestnut hair, whose presence rarely attracted anything more than passing indifference. She moved quietly, carrying neatly folded linens for the royal household while avoiding crowded hallways whenever possible. Charlotte had learned long ago that remaining unnoticed often spared her from whispered remarks and pitying glances. Although she served faithfully every day, she never truly belonged anywhere inside the palace. When evening arrived, every servant returned to shared quarters filled with familiar companions, but Charlotte often found herself awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. The crowded rooms, constant noise, and lingering tension left her restless night after night. Rather than disturb anyone, she would quietly gather a small blanket and sit beside a quiet hallway overlooking the palace gardens until exhaustion finally allowed her to drift into light sleep beneath the soft glow of moonlight. She never complained. She simply believed that some people were born without a place that truly felt like home. One unusually cool evening, as a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar through the open windows, Alpha King Ethan Ashford finished a late council meeting and dismissed his advisors with a calm nod. Choosing to walk back to his private chambers instead of taking the grand staircase, he followed a quieter corridor overlooking the eastern gardens. Halfway down the hall, he slowed his steps. Curled peacefully beside a tall window rested a young woman wrapped in a thin blanket. A folded sweater served as her pillow, and several books lay stacked neatly beside her, along with a small pouch of dried lavender that filled the air with a comforting fragrance. Ethan stood silently, surprised that anyone connected to the palace would sleep alone in such an empty place. He noticed she had carefully positioned herself where no one would be inconvenienced, leaving plenty of room for guards and servants to pass without interruption. Even while sleeping, she seemed more concerned about others than herself. One of the night attendants quietly approached and lowered his voice. "Your Majesty, that is Charlotte Bennet." Ethan kept his eyes on the sleeping Omega. "Why is she here instead of the servants' residence?" The attendant hesitated before answering. "She says the crowded quarters make it difficult for her to rest. She never asks for special treatment, so she simply sleeps wherever she believes she will not disturb anyone." Ethan remained silent. Moonlight rested gently across Charlotte's peaceful face, and despite the uncomfortable stone floor beneath her, she looked grateful simply to have found a quiet corner. He noticed the blanket covering her shoulders was far too thin for the cool autumn nights, yet she had tucked one edge around a stray palace kitten sleeping comfortably against her side. She had chosen warmth for the tiny animal before keeping it for herself. Something about that simple act settled deeply within him. Without waking her, Ethan removed his own heavy wool cloak and carefully draped it over both Charlotte and the sleeping kitten. She stirred only slightly before relaxing again, never realizing who had stopped beside her. Ethan turned toward the palace gardens, his expression thoughtful as the cedar trees swayed softly beneath the stars. In that quiet moment, a single decision took root within his heart. Before another night passed, Charlotte Bennet would have a place where she would never again wonder whether she belonged, and no one in the kingdom would be allowed to take that feeling of safety away from her. Charlotte Bennet woke just before sunrise with a gentle warmth resting across her shoulders that had not been there the night before. For a brief moment, she simply blinked at the pale morning sky beyond the tall palace windows, wondering whether she had been dreaming. Then she noticed the heavy wool cloak carefully wrapped around both herself and the tiny palace kitten still sleeping peacefully beside her. She looked around the empty corridor in quiet confusion. Whoever had covered her had already gone, leaving behind nothing except unexpected kindness. Charlotte carefully folded the expensive cloak with clean hands and carried it to the nearest palace attendant. "Someone must have forgotten this," she said softly. The elderly servant accepted it with surprised eyes, but offered no explanation. only thanking her before disappearing down the hallway. Charlotte smiled faintly and returned to her daily responsibilities without giving the mysterious gesture another thought. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Ashford Palace, Ethan Ashford stood inside the royal council chamber, studying a detailed architectural drawing spread across a polished oak table. Around him stood the kingdom's master builder, several trusted craftsmen, and his closest advisor, William Mercer. The room remained silent as Ethan traced one finger across the empty section of the blueprint overlooking the eastern gardens. "There is unused space here," he observed calmly. The master builder nodded. "It was originally intended for additional guest chambers, Your Majesty." Ethan looked toward the morning sunlight pouring through the windows before quietly shaking his head. "Not anymore." William watched him with growing curiosity. "May I ask what you wish to build instead?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "A nesting room." The craftsmen exchanged brief glances, uncertain they had heard correctly. Nesting rooms existed only in ancient stories or within the oldest Alpha traditions, reserved as deeply personal sanctuaries where trust, comfort, and peace mattered more than luxury or status. They were never discussed openly and certainly were not built inside royal palaces without extraordinary purpose. Ethan noticed their hesitation. "This room will not resemble the formal chambers used by nobles," he continued. "No marble floors, no crystal decorations, no unnecessary ornaments." He pointed toward the plans again. Natural cedar walls, large windows facing the sunrise, soft wool blankets, hand-woven rugs, living plants, fresh air, silence. The master builder slowly nodded while making careful notes. "Anything else, Your Majesty?" Ethan paused, remembering the quiet hallway where Charlotte had curled beside the window with a tiny kitten tucked safely beneath her blanket. "Bring clean straw from the northern meadows," he said. "The kind harvested before the autumn rain. Dry it carefully. Replace it often so it always carries the scent of fresh fields." One craftsman looked slightly puzzled. "Fresh straw, Your Majesty?" Ethan's expression remained composed. "Comfort is found in what feels familiar, not what appears expensive." The men immediately bowed and accepted the order. Construction began before noon under Ethan's direct supervision. Rather than assigning every decision to others, he visited the unfinished room several times throughout the day. He tested the softness of every blanket, rejected furniture with sharp corners, approved wide shelves for books, requested a rocking chair beside the largest window, and instructed gardeners to plant fragrant lavender and climbing jasmine just outside so gentle breezes would carry their calming scents indoors each morning. By evening, William quietly approached once again. "The room will be beautiful," he admitted. "Who is it for?" Ethan looked through the unfinished doorway where golden sunlight illuminated fresh cedar wood and neatly stacked bundles of clean straw waiting to be arranged. His answer came almost as a quiet promise. "For someone who has spent too many nights believing she does not deserve a place to rest." William followed his gaze without another question, while beyond the palace walls Charlotte finished another ordinary day, completely unaware that, only a short walk away, an entire sanctuary was slowly taking shape around the smallest details of a life she never imagined anyone had taken the time to notice. The construction crews arrived before sunrise, carrying bundles of fragrant straw harvested from the northern meadows, smooth cedar planks, woven baskets, and bolts of natural wool, while the eastern wing of Ashford Palace remained closed to everyone except those personally selected by Alpha King Ethan Ashford. Every worker received the same unusual instruction before stepping inside the unfinished room. They were to build with quiet hands, avoid unnecessary conversation, and remember that comfort mattered more than appearance. No polished marble was delivered. No sparkling chandeliers were requested. Instead, warm cedar filled the air with its gentle scent. Sunlight streamed through broad windows overlooking the gardens, and every detail reflected peace instead of grandeur. Ethan visited several times throughout the day, studying each corner with careful attention that surprised even the oldest craftsmen. When one worker suggested replacing the straw with luxurious imported cushions to better suit a royal palace, Ethan simply smiled and shook his head. "Luxury is impressive for visitors," he replied calmly. "Peace is what allows someone to breathe again." The workers quietly accepted his decision, and the clean golden straw was arranged beneath finely woven blankets exactly as he requested. Shelves were filled with empty spaces waiting for books. Flowering plants rested near the windows, and a rocking chair faced the morning sun so the first light of every day would gently enter the room. Meanwhile, life throughout the palace continued as it always had. Charlotte Bennet spent the afternoon helping organize linens for visiting noble families before carrying fresh flowers into the library. She greeted everyone with the same quiet kindness that had become almost invisible because it was offered so consistently. When an elderly cook accidentally dropped a basket of apples across the kitchen floor, Charlotte immediately knelt to gather every piece without waiting to be asked. When a young stable boy struggled to carry heavy buckets across the courtyard, she quietly lifted one herself despite the extra distance it added to her own work. She never expected gratitude. Helping simply felt natural to her. Yet while Charlotte moved through the palace unnoticed, whispers began following another story entirely. Servants noticed unusual deliveries entering the eastern wing. Gardeners wondered why fresh lavender had been planted outside a room that nobody occupied. Guards quietly discussed the king's order that the hallway remain undisturbed. Curiosity quickly spread beyond the servants until even visiting nobles began asking questions during afternoon tea. Some believed Ethan was preparing luxurious chambers for an important foreign queen. Others guessed he was creating a private retreat for himself away from royal responsibilities. No one imagined the truth. By evening, the rumors grew even stranger. Perhaps the Alpha King has become sentimental, one noblewoman remarked with a faint laugh. Or perhaps he is trying to revive traditions that disappeared generations ago, another replied. Their quiet amusement echoed through elegant hallways where appearances often carried more value than understanding. Charlotte happened to pass nearby while delivering fresh linens and heard fragments of the conversation, but she paid little attention. Matters involving royalty belonged to a world far beyond her own. She lowered her eyes respectfully and continued walking, unaware that the whispers filling the palace all centered around a place being created solely because of her existence. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the distant hills, Ethan stood alone inside the nearly completed room. The cedar walls glowed warmly beneath the evening light. The straw carried the comforting scent of late summer fields, and gentle breezes stirred the lavender blossoms outside the open windows. For the first time in many years, the room felt alive instead of empty. William Mercer stepped quietly into the doorway and studied the peaceful space before speaking. When people discover who this room belongs to, many of them will question your decision. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the cedar wall without looking away from the room. Then they will have the opportunity to learn that dignity is never determined by rank. Outside, the palace settled into another peaceful night, while Charlotte once again folded her blanket, preparing to spend another evening beside the quiet hallway window, never realizing that by the following sunrise her life, and the heart of an entire kingdom, would begin changing forever. The following afternoon, a royal attendant approached Charlotte Bennet while she was arranging fresh wildflowers inside the palace library. He bowed politely and handed her a small cream-colored envelope sealed with the crest of Ashford Palace. Charlotte accepted it with visible confusion because no one had ever delivered a personal invitation to her before. She carefully opened the envelope and read the brief message inside. Alpha King Ethan Ashford requested her presence in the eastern wing before sunset. No explanation followed, only the time and location written in elegant handwriting. Charlotte quietly thanked the attendant and spent the rest of the afternoon wondering whether she had somehow made a mistake in her duties. She replayed every task she had completed during the past week, searching for some forgotten error, yet nothing came to mind. As the golden light of evening spread across the palace gardens, she walked toward the eastern corridor with hesitant steps. She noticed two royal guards standing respectfully beside a newly crafted cedar door unlike any other entrance in the palace. Instead of polished marble surrounding it, climbing jasmine framed the doorway, and gentle lavender swayed beneath the windows while the fresh scent of cedar drifted through the peaceful hallway. One of the guards opened the door without speaking. Charlotte slowly stepped inside and stopped completely. Warm sunlight filled the room through wide windows overlooking the gardens where birds rested among flowering trees. Soft woven rugs covered the wooden floor, shelves weighted with carefully arranged books. A comfortable rocking chair faced the morning light, and baskets of fresh straw rested beneath layers of thick wool blankets that carried the comforting scent of clean fields after harvest. Living plants filled the corners, their green leaves moving gently in the afternoon breeze. Nothing inside the room felt grand or extravagant. Everything felt calm. Everything felt welcoming. Charlotte walked forward, almost afraid to touch anything. Her fingertips brushed the smooth cedar wall before she noticed a small woven basket containing dried lavender beside the window, exactly like the little pouch she always carried with her. Nearby rested a folded blanket in the same deep blue shade as the worn sweater she often used for a pillow during lonely nights in the hallway. She looked toward the windows where morning sunlight would surely arrive, first every day. It was the very direction she always chose whenever she searched for a quiet place to rest. One quiet realization followed another until tears slowly gathered in her eyes. None of these details could have appeared by accident. Someone had quietly observed the smallest pieces of her ordinary life. The gentle creak of the opening door broke the silence. Charlotte turned and saw Ethan Ashford entering alone, dressed simply in dark royal clothing without the ceremonial cloak he usually wore before the court. His expression remained calm as he looked around the room. "Do you like it?" he asked softly. Charlotte struggled to answer. "Your Majesty, this place is beautiful, but surely it was built for someone important." Ethan looked directly into her eyes with steady kindness. "It was." She lowered her gaze immediately. "Then I should leave before I disturb whoever belongs here." Ethan took one slow step forward and quietly shook his head. "Charlotte, there is no one else coming." She looked at him again, uncertain she had heard correctly. Ethan's voice remained gentle but unwavering. "This room was built for you." The words settled over the quiet room like sunlight through the windows. Charlotte stood perfectly still, unable to understand why the alpha king of an entire kingdom would create such a peaceful sanctuary for someone who had spent years believing she was almost invisible. As silence filled the space between them, she whispered the only question her heart could find. "Why would anyone do something like this for me?" Charlotte Bennet remained motionless as the quiet question lingered between them. Ethan Ashford did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the open window where the evening breeze carried the scent of lavender into the room. The fading sunlight rested across the cedar floor, warming every carefully chosen detail. At last he spoke in the same calm voice that had guided his kingdom through countless difficult decisions. "Because every person deserves one place where they never have to wonder if they belong." Charlotte lowered her eyes, struggling to accept words she had never expected to hear. "Your Majesty, I am only a palace servant." Ethan gently shook his head. "You are Charlotte Bennet. That is enough." She felt her throat tighten. Throughout her life, she had been introduced by titles that reminded people where she stood in the world. An Omega, a servant, someone easy to overlook. Very few people had ever spoken her name with such simple respect. Ethan continued walking through the room, stopping beside the rocking chair overlooking the gardens. "I have watched you for weeks," he admitted. Charlotte looked up in surprise, but there was nothing unsettling in his expression, only quiet honesty. "Not because I wish to judge you, because I wish to understand you." He rested one hand lightly on the chair. "I noticed you always choose the first morning light. I noticed you carry lavender wherever you go. I noticed you read whenever you have a few peaceful moments. I noticed that when others are tired, you help them before helping yourself. I noticed that even when you slept on a stone floor, you shared your blanket with a frightened kitten." Charlotte immediately remembered that cold autumn night and slowly realized who had covered her with the heavy wool cloak before dawn. Ethan offered a small smile that quietly confirmed her unspoken thought. "That was you," she whispered. He nodded once. "I could not leave you there without warmth." Tears gathered again in Charlotte's eyes, not because of sadness, but because someone had quietly seen the moments she believed no one had ever noticed. Before she could answer, hurried footsteps echoed through the eastern corridor. The doors suddenly opened, and Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the kingdom's oldest nobles, entered without waiting for permission. Two attendants followed behind him, looking deeply uncomfortable. Nathaniel glanced around the room with obvious disbelief before his eyes settled on Charlotte. "So the rumors are true. he said with restrained amusement. An entire sanctuary built for a servant. Charlotte instinctively stepped backward, embarrassed by the unexpected confrontation. Ethan remained perfectly composed. You entered without invitation, Lord Hawthorne. The nobleman ignored the remark and slowly walked toward the woven blankets. Surely your majesty understands how this appears to the court. This chamber occupies valuable space inside the royal palace. It should serve the kingdom, not one insignificant omega. Before Nathaniel could take another step, Ethan calmly moved between him and the center of the room. His voice never rose, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. Stop. The single command froze everyone where they stood. Ethan looked directly at the nobleman with quiet confidence. This room is not open for inspection. Nathaniel frowned. Surely I may at least examine what has been built. Ethan slowly shook his head. No. Silence filled the room. Even the attendants seemed to stop breathing. Ethan's expression remained gentle, but his decision was absolute. From this moment forward, no one enters this room without Charlotte Bennet's permission. Not advisors, not nobles, not guests, not even members of the royal council. This sanctuary exists so that one person will always know she has a place where her peace is protected. That purpose will not be compromised. Charlotte stared at him in complete disbelief. The nobleman looked equally stunned, realizing the Alpha King had just placed the privacy of an overlooked Omega above the expectations of the highest families in the kingdom. As Nathaniel slowly turned and left the room without another word, whispers were already beginning to spread beyond the eastern corridor, carrying news that before the next sunrise, every noble house in Ashford would be questioning why the Alpha King had forbidden an entire kingdom from crossing a single doorway. By the next morning, the story had traveled far beyond the eastern wing of Ashford Palace. Servants whispered about the cedar room where no one was allowed to enter. Merchants delivering supplies repeated the tale in the market square. Noble families arriving for the upcoming silver moon gathering quietly exchanged curious glances as they passed through the palace gates. Every version of the story became more unbelievable than the last. Some insisted the Alpha King had rediscovered an ancient royal tradition. Others claimed the room contained priceless treasures hidden from the court. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and none of them dared to speak against the king's direct command. Charlotte Bennet, however, felt the weight of every whispered conversation. Although no one confronted her openly, she noticed conversations stopping whenever she entered a room. Friendly smiles became cautious looks of curiosity. Even those who had always ignored her now watched her from across the palace corridors, wondering what could possibly have inspired the Alpha King to grant such extraordinary protection to someone so ordinary. Charlotte tried to continue her duties exactly as before. She arranged flowers in the dining hall, organized books in the library, and helped prepare guest rooms for visiting families, hoping the rumors would eventually fade. Instead, they only grew louder. Late that afternoon, she quietly slipped into the nesting room after finishing her work. The familiar scent of cedar and lavender immediately eased the tightness in her chest. Sunlight filtered gently through the wide windows, painting warm patterns across the woven rugs, while the fresh straw beneath the blankets carried the comforting fragrance of open fields. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to sit without worrying about who might need her next. She slowly settled into the rocking chair beside the window and closed her eyes as the breeze brushed softly across her face. It felt peaceful in a way she had never experienced before, yet instead of happiness, she felt guilt growing inside her heart. She wondered how many people now questioned Ethan Ashford's judgment because of her. She remembered Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne's expression and imagined similar conversations taking place throughout every noble household. The thought troubled her deeply. She had never wanted attention, and she certainly had never wished to become the reason the Alpha King faced criticism. As evening approached, Ethan entered quietly and immediately noticed the concern in her eyes. "This room is not bringing you peace today," he observed gently. Charlotte looked toward the gardens before answering. "Everyone is talking because of me." Ethan remained calm. "They are talking because they do not yet understand." She slowly shook her head. "Your Majesty, I cannot allow your kindness to become a burden on your kingdom. If closing this room would end the rumors, then perhaps it should never have been built." Ethan walked toward the window until they stood side by side, overlooking the fading sunlight across the gardens. "Charlotte," he said softly, "if I abandoned every decision that others questioned, I would never accomplish anything worth protecting." She remained silent. He continued, "Leadership is not choosing what is easiest to explain. Leadership is standing beside what is right even before others understand it." His words settled gently into the quiet room, but Charlotte's heart remained unsettled. Long after Ethan left to attend an evening council meeting, she stayed beside the window watching darkness slowly cover the gardens. A painful decision quietly formed in her mind. If her presence inside the palace continued placing Ethan between compassion and public expectation, then perhaps the greatest kindness she could offer him was to remove herself from the problem entirely. Before dawn arrived, while the palace still slept beneath the fading stars, Charlotte carefully folded every blanket, straightened every basket of straw exactly as she had found it, placed a handwritten note of gratitude on the rocking chair, and quietly stepped out of the nesting room with a small travel bag resting over her shoulder, believing that leaving without a farewell was the only gift she still had left to give the man who had given her a place to belong. The palace had barely awakened when Ethan Ashford entered the nesting room, carrying a small basket of fresh lavender he had gathered himself from the eastern gardens. He expected to find Charlotte Bennet sitting beside the window where the first rays of morning sunlight always touched the cedar floor. Instead, silence greeted him. The rocking chair stood perfectly still. The blankets had been folded with careful hands. Every woven basket rested exactly where it belonged. Nothing was out of place except for a single handwritten note resting quietly on the chair. Ethan picked it up and recognized Charlotte's gentle handwriting immediately. She thanked him for giving her the first place where she had ever felt completely safe. She wrote that his kindness had changed her life forever, but she could not allow the kingdom to question his judgment because of her. She hoped that one day the room would remind him that his compassion had healed someone who had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Finally, she apologized for leaving without saying goodbye and wished peace upon both him and the kingdom he protected. Ethan slowly lowered the letter without speaking. William Mercer arrived moments later after receiving word that the king had requested him. One look at Ethan's expression was enough to tell him something had changed. His eyes moved to the empty room before quietly asking, "Where is she?" Ethan handed him the note. William read it in silence, then looked toward the open doorway. "She believes she is protecting you." Ethan folded the letter with extraordinary care before placing it inside his coat pocket. "She is protecting everyone except herself." Without another word, he turned and walked briskly through the palace corridors. Servants stepped aside respectfully as the Alpha King crossed the eastern wing with steady purpose. He reached the front gates just as the morning guards completed their shift. "Did Charlotte Bennet leave the palace?" he asked. One guard nodded. "Just before sunrise, Your Majesty." She carried only a small travel bag and walked toward the old forest road leading to the northern hills. Ethan thanked him quietly before continuing toward the royal stables. Within minutes, he was riding alone beneath the cool morning sky, following the peaceful road lined with towering cedar trees whose branches swayed gently above him. Several miles beyond the palace, he finally spotted Charlotte walking along a narrow path overlooking a quiet valley filled with wildflowers. She heard the approaching horse and stepped aside respectfully, expecting another traveler. When she recognized Ethan, surprise filled her face. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Ethan dismounted and approached her slowly, leaving several respectful steps between them. Neither spoke for a long moment while the morning breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley. Charlotte lowered her eyes. "I did not wish to cause you any more difficulty." Ethan answered softly, "You never did." She looked at him with quiet sadness. "Everyone is questioning your decisions because of me." Ethan shook his head. "No, Charlotte. They are questioning my decision because they have not yet learned what true strength looks like." She tried to smile, but uncertainty remained in her eyes. "If I leave, the rumors will disappear." Ethan looked across the peaceful valley before speaking again. "Do you know why I built that room?" Charlotte hesitated before shaking her head. "It was never meant to be a gift," he said. "It was a promise." She looked at him with quiet confusion. Ethan continued, his voice carrying the same calm certainty that had first made an entire kingdom trust him. Every night you searched for a place where you would not inconvenience anyone else. I wanted you to know that there is at least one place in this world where your presence is never an inconvenience. A place that waits for you simply because you exist. Charlotte felt tears quietly fill her eyes once more. Ethan stepped no closer, allowing her the space to choose freely. If you leave because that is truly what your heart desires, I will respect your decision. But if you are leaving only because you believe you are unworthy of being protected, then I cannot allow that misunderstanding to become the final chapter of your story. Charlotte looked back toward the distant palace rising beyond the hills, and for the first time since she had begun walking away, she found herself wondering whether the place she had tried so hard to leave behind had finally become the home she had spent her entire life searching for. Charlotte Bennet stood quietly beneath the towering cedar trees as Ethan Ashford's words settled gently into her heart. The morning breeze carried the distant songs of birds across the valley, and for the first time in many years she allowed herself to believe that perhaps leaving was not the only way to protect someone she cared about. She slowly lowered her travel bag onto the grass and looked toward Ethan with uncertain eyes. I have spent so much of my life trying not to become a burden, she admitted softly. I no longer know how to let someone carry part of that weight for me. Ethan smiled with quiet understanding. You were never meant to carry it alone. Neither of them spoke again for several moments. There was no need to rush the silence. Eventually Charlotte nodded almost imperceptibly. If you still wish for me to return, I would like to come home. Ethan's expression softened in a way very few people had ever witnessed. Then let us go home together. They returned to Ashford Palace just as preparations for the annual Silver Moon gathering reached their busiest hour. Noble families from every corner of the kingdom filled the grand halls dressed in elegant formal attire, while musicians rehearsed beneath crystal chandeliers and servants made final arrangements for the evening celebration. News of Charlotte's return spread almost as quickly as the earlier rumors of her departure. Curious whispers followed as Ethan entered through the great doors beside her instead of several steps ahead, as royal custom usually demanded. Charlotte felt dozens of watchful eyes upon her, but Ethan remained completely composed, matching his pace to hers without hesitation. That evening, the great hall shimmered beneath thousands of candlelights reflecting against polished stone walls. Representatives from every respected family gathered before the royal platform, where Ethan traditionally welcomed the kingdom before the Silver Moon festivities officially began. Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne stood among the assembled nobles, his expression measured but unmistakably skeptical. Many others shared the same quiet expectation. They believed the Alpha King would finally explain the mysterious nesting room that had become the center of every conversation throughout the kingdom. Ethan stepped forward, and the hall immediately fell silent. His calm voice carried effortlessly through the enormous chamber. For several days, many of you have questioned a decision I made within this palace. A ripple of quiet movement passed through the audience. Ethan continued without the slightest trace of uncertainty. You questioned why one room was placed beyond the reach of every noble, every advisor, every honored guest, and every member of my own court. He turned slightly toward Charlotte, who stood quietly near the front of the gathering. The answer is very simple. Every eye in the hall followed his gaze. Ethan descended from the royal platform until he stood beside Charlotte instead of above her. Then he addressed the kingdom once more. Power is often measured by how much authority a ruler possesses. I disagree. True strength is measured by how safely the weakest person under that ruler's care is allowed to live. Complete silence filled the hall. Ethan looked toward the assembled families one by one. Charlotte Bennet never asked for privilege. She never demanded recognition. She spent years making herself smaller so others would never feel inconvenienced by her existence. I refuse to allow that to continue inside my kingdom. His words settled deeply over the gathering. Then, with quiet confidence, he reached out his hand toward Charlotte. She looked at him with tears quietly shining in her eyes before placing her hand in his. Ethan gently closed his fingers around hers and spoke the words that transformed the palace forever. The nesting room was never built because Charlotte is extraordinary in the eyes of the court. It was built because she is invaluable in mine. From this day forward, let there be no confusion. Charlotte Bennet is the woman I have chosen to stand beside, and the sanctuary prepared within this palace will forever belong only to her. because every promise I made when I built it was made with my whole heart. The great hall remained perfectly still, as though an entire kingdom needed one long breath to understand that history had quietly changed before their very eyes. For several long moments, no one inside the great hall spoke. Thousands of candle flames flickered gently against the high stone walls while Ethan Ashford and Charlotte Bennet stood together beneath the silver banners of the kingdom. The silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. One by one, members of the royal court slowly lowered their heads in respect. Even Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose doubts had echoed louder than most, stepped forward with measured dignity. He placed one hand across his chest and bowed toward Charlotte. "Lady Bennet," he said sincerely, "I believed your majesty had allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. Today I realize I failed to recognize wisdom when it stood before me. Please accept my apology." Charlotte looked at the elderly noble with quiet surprise before offering a gentle smile. "Thank you, my lord." There was no resentment in her voice, only kindness. That simple grace seemed to touch everyone watching. Throughout the hall, conversations that had once been filled with suspicion transformed into quiet admiration. They finally understood that the Alpha King had never been defending privilege. He had been defending dignity. Ethan looked across the gathered families before speaking once more. A kingdom becomes stronger when every person knows they have value, regardless of rank or title. Let this be remembered not as the day one room was built, but as the day we chose what kind of kingdom we wished to become. His words were met not with loud celebration, but with respectful applause that slowly filled the hall like gentle rain after a long season of drought. Later that evening, after the silver moon gathering came to a close and the palace corridors had grown peaceful once again, Ethan led Charlotte back toward the eastern wing. The familiar scent of cedar greeted them before they even reached the door. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the jasmine vines climbing softly around the entrance. Ethan stopped before the cedar door and reached into his coat pocket. From a small velvet pouch, he removed a single handcrafted key made of polished silver with delicate cedar leaves engraved along its handle. He placed it carefully into Charlotte's hand. "This belongs to you," he said quietly. Charlotte looked down at the key, hardly believing it was real. "Your Majesty," Ethan gently interrupted her with a warm smile. "When you first slept beside the hallway window, you chose the smallest corner because you believed taking up less space would make life easier for everyone else. I never want you to feel that way again." He nodded toward the door. "This room will never be locked against you. It will only ever be locked for you." Charlotte's fingers gently closed around the silver key as tears filled her eyes once again. Together they stepped inside the nesting room. Everything remained exactly as she remembered it. The cedar walls glowed warmly beneath soft lantern light. Fresh straw had been carefully replaced. Lavender rested beside the windows. The rocking chair waited quietly where the morning sun would soon rise again. Yet something inside the room had changed. It no longer felt like a place borrowed from someone else's kindness. It felt like home. Charlotte slowly walked to the center of the room before turning back toward Ethan. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for building this room. Thank you for seeing me when I believed I had disappeared." Ethan's eyes softened. "You were never invisible, Charlotte. The world simply had not learned where to look." Outside, the first stars of the evening stretched across the peaceful sky above Ashford Palace, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar and lavender through the open windows. Inside the quiet sanctuary, no crown, title, or ancient tradition mattered as much as the simple promise that had transformed two lives. The Alpha King had built walls of cedar, filled them with humble straw, and closed the door to everyone else, not because he wished to keep the kingdom out, but because he wanted one woman who had spent her entire life searching for safety to finally know that there would always be one place in the world where she would be welcomed before she even knocked, cherished before she even spoke, and loved simply because she was Charlotte Bennet.